Looking to break into or advance your career in cybercrime and cybersecurity? Push your career forward with a master's degree in cybercrime and digital investigation from Michigan State University. Experience a nationally ranked program taught by world-renowned researchers and practitioners that can help you play a role in combating cybercrime and advancing justice for victims. Designed to be completed in as little as 2 years and in a flexible online format that can work around your schedule. Visit cj.msu.edu to learn more.
Welcome, everybody, to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. My name is Tom Holt. I'm a professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. I'm also the director for the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training. And I'm here with my excellent co-hosts, as always.
I'm Dr. Rachel McNealey. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice, and I'm an associate with the center.
I'm Dr. Taylor Fisher. I am a postdoc here at Michigan State, and I, too, am an associate with the center.
And so the point of the show is to talk about issues that are relevant to cybercrime, cybersecurity, give you some different angles on how things work, and try to help people connect with either academic research or practitioner understanding of different threats. And this week we're going to talk about an issue that is very, very challenging. It's sensitive, and it relates to the way the technology is misused to engage in sextortion, which is a complicated behavior that cuts across what we understand about, say, child sexual exploitation, but it also can involve hacking. There's a lot of different stuff that comes up when people talk about sextortion as a concept. So what comes to your mind when we hear that word?
I mean, I think we were all together in a meeting last week or the week before, and this story in Michigan dropped that I was really impacted by, and it was a teenager in Michigan who was being sextorted. Essentially, a friend got concerned. The friend's mother, I believe, called the police. The police came to do a wellness check, and the child, thinking that he was about to be arrested by the police at his house, took his own life in response, which is horrifying all the way down. And the perpetrator was another teenager in Michigan who had done it, I think, to 17 other teenagers. And I was taken aback because my understanding of it thus far was that those larger schemes were typically being perpetrated by people overseas with a financial end goal. And I think, that was maybe just me not paying attention, but that was the first one I'd seen where, we don't know why the juvenile offender engaged in that. That's something that's big on my mind, is how do you, at that young of an age, end up doing something like that to 17 other youths? And so I think it's just an emerging problem that's emerging in a lot of different ways, and it's kind of scary.
It's very scary. I think what comes to my mind is the ages are getting younger and younger, right? Like you said, my understanding was always it was this kind of organized effort to get money out of people when you find things online that could be misused. But now seeing the amount of, consensually shared images that are being part of these larger cases and how young these kids are, right? Like these early teenagers that are engaging in these behaviors thinking it's completely normal, all my friends are doing it, and then suddenly it's being used against them. And that is just heartbreaking to see.
I know. I think about my own kids who've had iPads since they were around 5, and to suddenly have to explain to them as they're getting older, look, I know you've made videos of yourself, I know you've done X, Y, and Z with your device, but now you've got to change your entire relationship to this device. Mm-hmm. It's hard to really understand how that would impact them, because I'm coming at this from the perspective of, well, this is something I've only had for 20 years versus this is the thing I grew up with. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how we do that effectively, but it's certainly part of the conversation. And so for this week, we've got a great guest with us. It's Dr. Roberta Liggett O'Malley, who's an assistant professor of criminology at the University of South Florida, Sarasota, Manistee. And she is a leading expert in the space. And she's also a Spartan. She got her PhD here at MSU. So it's great to have you on.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad to be on.
Yeah. So tell us how you got started doing cybercrime research to begin with.
Well, I think what got me into cybercrime research was really being very interested in violence and interpersonal violence, and then growing up in a period where so much of what we see about crime and violent crime has these different technological components to it. So I think I really entered the cybercrime space accidentally. I was really interested in learning more about violence, the exploitation of children, and in this day and age, it's really hard to not think about technology when we think about the new iterations of how children and young people are being victimized today. And so I kind of got into cybercrime that way and have never really looked back.
So before we dive too far in, can you talk a little bit about how we're seeing violence and technology interact? Because that's kind of counterintuitive, right? It really wouldn't make sense to the average person that violence is occurring in an online platform. So could you speak to that just a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So I think that the way in which we think about kind of how we interact with other people has changed just substantially in the last, 20, 30 years. Where everything was face-to-face, things are now becoming more digital. I think there is this issue that we have where people kind of underestimate the impacts of what violence looks like when it's happening online versus offline, because it seems like there's some sort of removal. But in my opinion, and kind of as shown in my research, is that space that we think when we think about looking at yourself with a phone or with a device is actually closer than we think it is. It's not actually that removed from a perpetrator. And really the devices have really changed kind of what violence looks like. So for example, individuals who are using technology to communicate with other people can get harassed in a way that is completely different from how our legal code thinks about harassment. So if you think about kind of how we define and criminalize harassment, it's usually a course of conduct perpetrated by a person against another person, where you can establish that that person has been engaging in several different instances in which they've been harassing somebody and causing a certain level of emotional distress. And that's completely flipped on its head. If we think about bullying, if we think about harassment, we see that it might not just be one person. It might be someone's entire school. It happens 24/7 from your pocket. And it's really hard to think about how that's not super impactful and doesn't have an impact on people's behavior. And so when we think about violence, we really tend to think a lot about kind of that person-to-person, in-person contact. But what we're seeing is that devices are facilitating a whole host of kinds of violence that are really impactful for victims and highly distressing.
And on its face, you would think that technology facilitated abuse would be A, easy to catch, and B, easy to prevent, because digital evidence, once it's there, it's there. You have so many people interacting with it, especially in schools, that things are being shared widely, right? But it's almost like this kind of abuse has been normalized to the extent where it's very diminished compared to quote-unquote traditional physical violence. So do you think kind of that's playing a part in how people view it? Is that's just how it goes? If you're going to use a phone, if you're going to go on Instagram, some horrendous stuff is going to be said to you,
Right. So there is kind of these preconceived notions of your contract with the internet, this idea of don't complain too much, don't break the internet, but also this idea of oh, you're engaging in these spaces, maybe you just have to deal with this kind of behavior. And we wouldn't necessarily deal with that kind of behavior in face-to-face spaces. There's a lot more social etiquette that is at play that's preventing some of this behavior. But it just, the nature of technology just makes it so much more extreme. So if I were to have an argument with someone in person, maybe those three people that I'm having an argument with are captured in there and we're all arguing. But if it's happening online, it brings more people into it, more people can comment, more people can pile on, and it just becomes kind of out of control. But there definitely is this sense of, well, what do you expect if you want to be on these kinds of places, that I think make victims either not take it seriously enough to report it, or other people not take it seriously enough to step in.
Well, I think we've discussed, too, how unfair would it be for us to say, just don't use the internet? How can you do that, right? If we were being harassed at the bank, that would be an issue. But if I'm banking online, is that any different? Shouldn't be, but it is. And so now so much of our lives are online. You can't just have that mentality of, well, if you don't like it, don't use it. Because you can't do that.
Don't feed the trolls,
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that is really a huge issue. So in some of my research looking at victims and how they respond to their own victimization, a lot of them choose to remove themselves from online. They shut down their profiles, they make everything super private, but that actually is a barrier. That's actually a social impact of being victimized digitally, because when you think about the world, like, it's a digital place now. You have a LinkedIn profile. You want to advertise your work. If you want to advertise that you're looking for work, you want to be in these online places where people can look you up. It's very rare that a job is not going to Google you to find information about you, and your lack of profile is a red flag as much as too much is a red flag. Yeah. And so being unable to engage fully and equally in an online space is actually a huge problem, and we see that as a real ramification of harassment. We know that, for example, when it comes to sexual harassment, women are often targeted, and they feel like they can't engage fully or equally in online spaces, that they have to keep things much more private in a way that other people don't have to think about, and that it does have serious consequences for several modalities of your life.
And so we've mentioned it already, but how do you define sextortion in your own work?
Oh, yeah. So I take a more broad approach in defining sextortion. So I define sextortion as really the threats to publicly disseminate sexual or intimate videos, images, or information unless a victim complies with a person's demands or that offender or the perpetrator's demands.
I was reading, honestly, it might have been one of your papers that I'm just not remembering, but talking about the intersection of these things like sextortion and intimate partner violence. I was reading about sextortion being used to get someone to unblock you if you've blocked them in response to a breakup or abuse. Basically sextorting them to say, take my calls or I'm going to send your nudes to your grandma. And again, that just supersedes the assumptions you have that it's strangers, that it's, even if it's people you know, it's not a loved one. But this is so common with interpersonal abuse, right? It's the people closest around you. That blew my mind.
Yeah, right. And that was a big part of kind of my early research and looking and taking this more broad definition of sextortion, because what we quickly started to realize was that the tactic of sextortion is utilized by multiple different kinds of peoples for very different kinds of motivations. And so very commonly we see sextortion within these intimate violent contexts where people might have consensually shared images with a partner or a former partner, or maybe even these images were non-consensually created within an abusive partnership, and that these images just are routinely used against victims to get them to comply with a range of different kinds of demands, oftentimes to keep communicating with the offender, to stay in the relationship. We had a case in Florida where someone was asked to quit their job and leave town, or else they were going to send this kind of material to everyone in their workplace. And it can get really coercive. But then, of course, we're also seeing a huge increase in these kinds of sextortion, which we call kind of financial sextortion crimes, which are what you were talking about earlier in the program, which is most people who are overseas or part of these transnational cybercrime organizations targeting predominantly young men, again, with the demand of paying a financial ransom to stop the exposure of sexual images. And then again, on the other hand, we see a lot of these kinds of crimes being perpetrated against children as part of kind of the overall child exploitation and sexual solicitation context. So sextortion seems to be very effective, and lots of perpetrators are using these ruses to force individuals to comply with whatever their demand is.
So how do you do research on a topic like this, given victims may not want to come forward, or it's such a complicated case where you've got one person victimizing a bunch of people at once? How do you get data on this?
So that's a great question. I think I'm always, as a researcher, trying to find more ways to get data and to really understand kind of what the scope of this problem looks like. So historically, I've used a lot of court documents, so detailed indictments and criminal complaints that really document kind of what strategies offenders took to target individuals through sextortion ruses. But I've also started to survey sextortion victim survivors in the places where they seem to congregate. So one of the issues that I think a lot of victims of sextortion have is that they're not always sure where to go, especially those who've been perpetrated by strangers across seas. Oftentimes, if they do call the police, there's not a lot that officers can do because of the multi-jurisdictional issues inherent in these kinds of crimes. And so to support themselves, they've created these really rich kind of online supportive communities that allow them to share information and get support and get advice on what they can do next. And I've done a couple survey projects where I've asked them to kind of talk a little bit more about their experiences and kind of how the sextortion unfolded. So, yeah, a mix of court documents and victim survey research.
It's interesting to me how social media is kind of a double-edged sword in this, right? You talk about how social media can bring people together, can help spread resources, can help get these people to other people who have been through what they've gone through. But then also, you know, parents put out images of their young kids publicly. Those can be taken and used for these same terrible reasons. So it's so interesting to me how we create these sort of platforms that we like to use and for good, positive reasons, and then they get found out. Or not found out, what's the word? Exploited, thank you. JJ, if you could fix that for me, that'd be fantastic. No, I'm just kidding. But seeing how social media can allow these things to be exploited has certainly changed over the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm imagining the proliferation of AI and deep fakes playing a huge part in making this even worse than it already is. Especially if you're talking about young kids who, if they're presented with an AI-generated deepfake image of themselves, and they know that they've never taken a picture, they've never been in front of a webcam, they've never been in a position to have an image taken of them like that, if you're so young that you don't understand that it has to be fake, and you can be convinced that it's real, that's terrifying. That's awful. Because then you can completely skip the step of coercing a child into providing images in the first place and just present them with completely fabricated ones and expedite the process, basically. So has this been showing up in sextortion cases as of now, or, you know, an element of them?
Yeah, AI and the deepfakes is probably going to be where we see these ruses really going. So there hasn't been a ton of recent cases, but they're creeping up. They're definitely happening. So I know kind of through my work with kind of looking at like victim narratives that some have talked about how they're using deepfakes in order to coerce other individuals into like paying a financial ransom. It's definitely happening. We see AI use within child pornography or child sexual abuse material type cases, and I think we're really having to kind of grapple with like what this is going to look like for how we charge individuals for these kinds of things, like how the crime changes. It's really going to impact, I think, a lot of what we understand about image-based crimes for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think we should stop the access to paid notification apps and things like that? Or, I mean, what's the most logical response to this thing?
I don't know. It's just, I think it's so complicated because a part of me as a human being and a person, I just don't understand just the fact that these things exist and that's their one goal is to like create like nudes, like to me seems like a huge issue, and my initial gut reaction is, yeah, we shouldn't have that. There's no appropriate way in which that should happen where you're able to just take an image and make it sexualized without ever having consent on the person whose image you're using. So I don't think that those should exist at all. But another issue is that AI keeps getting better and better and better. And so how do we find kind of a technological tool that can help to detect AI images and take them down or flag them or at least identify them as AI so that individuals know that they're not real? But even then, it's highly, like, it's just such a violating kind of experience to see fake images of yourself through these different kinds of software. I can't imagine what that would be like. even if someone says, "Oh, this isn't real," it's like still just a terrible kind of invasion of privacy.
In March, and I've talked about this case in the trainings that we do through our Center for cybercrime investigation and training for line officers. And there was a case with a Mississippi teacher, and he had taken photos off of 2 of his students' social media and basically generated sexual images of them. And no one would have known except he uploaded them to his work Google Drive, and they were running from what I understand, a district-wide program called Rover that flags inappropriate content. And that's how it was discovered. And the number one question I've gotten when I've presented that both to the officers at our training and in a couple of guest lectures is, how do you conceptualize who the victim is in that scenario? To me, it's not a question. It's the 2 girls whose photos were taken and generated into something else. But I think that line isn't as clear-cut as other forms of crime when, okay, but it's not really a picture of you. It's an imagined picture of you? I don't know. What are your thoughts on...
Well, we have to think about other sources of victimization. Like, there's training data that goes into AI, and like, where are they getting these training data? If it's from pornographic stars, like, do they know that their data is being used for training? Like, that could be like a copyright issue, or that could be like another kind of crime that's part of this whole overall problem. When we think about the idea of AI child sexual abuse material, and people saying, well, there's no actual victim, but they're pulling from images and making a composite. And if you pull enough images, you might actually accidentally create a real likeness to a real child somewhere, and that is victimizing. So it is, we have to start to kind of broaden our idea of harm, and also incorporate societal harm as well. Like, do we want a proliferation of obscene images of children on the dark web, even if they're not real? Like, even if they're not real people, like, what does that do for society? And that's another harm that we have to consider.
That's one thing I wonder if people fundamentally understand. If you have a public Facebook profile or a public Instagram profile, that all the pictures you're posting, even if they're of your kids, are all potentially just going to be scraped and used by some LLM as a data source, whether you've consented to it or not, because you just posted things online. And I don't even know, I don't know how to communicate that clearly to the average person in a way that might connect, but that is something that's really important.
I know, it's something that you really have to think about, and it's hard in this like digital world. Like, what if you keep everything super private, but your place of work takes an image of you and puts it on their social media? It's like it's almost an impossible thing to police every single image of you that might or may not exist online, but no one knows where that data is going. That might be used for these like large training models, and that there's nothing you can really do about it. And so and because of that, like, have we it really raises a lot of questions about responsibility. Like, like, if there's no ability to control how these images are used or how they're used for training, who is responsible for helping you keep your data private? Or does it mean that we just can't use these applications and platforms that we valued for the last 2 decades, and maybe that is going to be a risk that social media platforms have to now take on and make a priority for them in order to keep users from wanting to engage in social media.
You bring up a really great point with like the role of these platforms, because I think that's something that gets forgotten, particularly in the AI area, but more generally, is that there are platforms that can take action, right? It's not that they can't or being stopped from doing it, it's just extra work on their part. And so how do we incentivize them to do that? But then on the flip side too, there are third-party organizations that are incredibly beneficial in these areas, like these people that take down images on the internet and, you know, help victims work through it. So it's interesting how this sort of commercialism of AI as a tool has created an issue, but at the same time, this online platform has brought resources that might be beneficial to victims.
Right, yeah, I see the potential for AI and other kinds of technologies and being both a little bit part of the problem, but can possibly definitely be part of a broader investment in solutions. So I think a lot of what I would like to see, especially when it comes to social media platforms, is something that I've always talked about all the time, which is put the interventions, put the solutions where the victims congregate, and have it there in the time that they need it. So, for example, if we know that a quarter of financial sextortion victims have been specifically targeted through dating applications, then dating applications can do some very easy awareness building tools, like among their constituents and users, and have them be able to recognize fraudulent profiles. They could instill initiatives that require you to, in some way, verify your identity and not have all these different kinds of fake platforms across dating applications. We can ensure that through Instagram, another really big spot in which people are victimized by sextortion, when you hit report, you have a sextortion button, and in that button, it can say, these are where you can go to take down your image, and this is the tool that is available through XYZ agency. If you need, or at least be able to say, when you report this to law enforcement, please take screenshots, then block your abuser, and kind of give them steps that they can take that are very straightforward and concrete that would help reduce kind of the emotional distress of being a victim, but also get them to a place where they can kind of move on and solve and take action against what's happening. And many of these are very reactive, as well. And I think that, but I think them together, I think you need to have prevention and response working together, and it should be in the application where people are being victimized or where the potential victims are, in order to make sure that they understand kind of what these red flags are, or at least, and if it happens to them, and hopefully not, they know where they can turn to, especially in cases where an arrest might not necessarily be likely.
So since you've used a lot of policing data for your research, what would you say is the primary conclusion about the capacity of law enforcement to deal with sextortion?
Mixed. So this goes back to the idea that sextortion is a term that's broad, that overlaps with a lot of different crimes. So I've seen a really incredible response from law enforcement when it comes to sextortion crimes that are victimizing children. So they are highly responsive. They are engaging in a lot of proactive intelligence gathering. Half of the victims that we are able to identify come from intelligence gathering, not just from victim reports, which is kind of a really devastating when you think about it. But they are really on the ground. They are in these forums. They are identifying victims. They are reaching out, and they are trying to prevent these crimes from getting more from happening, and responding to them when they do. I think the challenge comes from other ways in which sextortion is being used, and I think the capacity for those are really low. I think there's a lot of investigators who really, really care about the victimization, like these financial sextortion type crimes, and are deeply frustrated by how difficult they are to actually investigate. So mostly because of the multiple jurisdictions and the fact that they can't always offer a victim who's reporting a lot of solutions that involve the justice system. So a lot of times they are telling them to stay offline or block their offender or whatever. And I think that is a strategy, but it's not a long-term strategy. So I think that we do need a lot more training, especially for local law enforcement and line officers. I think that a lot of them feel like they can't do anything about these crimes, when really they can be a portal for services, and they can at least help individuals recoup some financial loss. And I think that oftentimes they kind of see the cyber element and they get a little spooked. So, but when it comes to the crimes against children, they're performing incredible work.
Mm-hmm. That's something I always talk about too in terms of legislation, right? The federal level legislation against child sexual abuse material is by far one of the criminal laws with the most teeth. I think that is the most effectively applied, because child victims are among the most vulnerable populations in our society, ipso facto. And also politically, right? Because legislation is political. You can motivate easily to protect children. But when you have adult victims and people argue that it's their own choices that have arrived them at victimization, it becomes a lot more thorny. And I think, the response options are much more limited in their eyes as well, too. That's interesting you've seen the same thing, because that's kind of what we've been seeing as well up here.
Do you think civil penalties are maybe a better way for adults to go? Some sort of a civil suit against the offender or anything that would gain economic recompense?
Yeah, I think if you are able to put the resources into that, I think that a civil response is definitely valid. So there's been some success for individuals who've had their images distributed to copyright those images and therefore use copyright law to try to reduce the spread of those images across different platforms. And that is definitely one effective way. I think some of the issues with that is that it does require resources and money and time and a legal team to help you move through that process. And then it also puts the onus on you to own your own copyright and to send out notices that people are in violation of your copyright. So that is definitely a strategy. I think it is an effective strategy. It's not necessarily the easiest one for most victims to engage in.
I'm really glad we brought up legislation, because this is a theme that we've been talking about, is how legislation kind of falls behind a lot, right? Legislation is hard to keep up, particularly with cyber as technology evolves, right? And trying to explain that to students or to just the average person is really hard, because they're like, well, we have an issue, why can't we fix it? And I think the term revenge porn is a great example of how legislation tries to keep up, but is inevitably going to be behind, right? This term revenge porn, we've kind of put it aside to say porn is consensual. We don't want to associate that with a criminal act, but yet so many legislative efforts still use that term, revenge porn. And so it's like, I'm really proud of you guys for taking that step to say, hey, I'm going to do something about this crime that we're seeing. But it's just another example of within, 5 years, now this term is out of date. It's not, up with the academic standards, maybe interpreted differently now because there's different meanings to it. And so I think this is a really great example of how cyber, particularly, that relationship with legislation is incredibly tricky.
Right, yeah. So I think, and also kind of in that same example, you have to have the laws in order to mobilize the Justice Department. Like if, like at the end of the day, police officers, their role is to document and fact find to see if there's been a violation of a criminal code. And if there is no criminal code, then it forces them to be creative and on their feet and try to think about other ways in which you can kind of understand how this crime is unfolding. So we see things like sentencing gaps, like when things actually do get prosecuted. Sextortionists who target children go away for a long time. It's very definitive. The image in and of itself being produced is enough to get you in jail versus proving that you were extorted within the process. But for a lot of adults, like sometimes they're like, oh, they're being charged with cyber stalking. Sometimes they're being charged with cyber harassment. Sometimes offenders are being charged with hacking type offenses, computer intrusion offenses. And it's just super variable, which obviously makes research very difficult, because if you're trying to understand the whole scope of these extortionate type crimes and you're trying to rely on how they're being charged, it's very hard to find the type of offenses in which like adult men and women are victimized. So that's a huge issue. I think that there's been investment in trying to criminalize the distribution of images and non-consensual distribution. But in sextortion, nothing might get distributed. It's really just the threat and the coercive threat to distribute that is the crime. And if there is no sextortion law, or if extortion laws are not rewritten to accommodate kind of this type of crime, or this type of way in which this crime occurs, then it really just ties the hands of law enforcement, who don't quite know kind of like, okay, well then how do I document this? How do I show that a law has been broken?
So if I'm a parent and my kid is thankfully good enough to tell me this is happening, for whatever reason they're worried enough or they're scared or whatever, and they come to me and say, hey, this is what's going on, what's the first thing you would tell a parent to do in terms of who do they contact, what should they be doing?
Yeah, so I think if you're a parent of a child who's being victimized by sextortion, the first thing you should do is try to collect as much evidence as you can that you have availability to collect, and then call law enforcement, report the incident, and then cease all communication with the offender. So don't try to keep talking to them. Don't try to get more information out of them. Collect what you have. Shut off all communication with the offender and call your local law enforcement. You can report through them, and they can kind of help you kind of go through steps of what else you can do. Again, kind of with cyber crimes, it becomes a little bit complicated. I think that there's a lot of victims who don't really want to call law enforcement. I can't make any guarantees that if you do, they're going to open a case and arrest somebody who's been victimizing you. But it does at least help us kind of document that instance. It does help for data collection and understanding of kind of how prevalent this issue is. And it can help if for example, if a minor has paid some money, can help hopefully kind of get that money back. But really, the minute you kind of cease communication with your sextortionist, especially in financial sextortion cases, it tends to end. They usually move on to somebody else. At the end of the day, when it comes to financial sextortion, they tend to, it's not in their best interest to distribute your images, because then they can't go back to you and threaten you with their distribution to get more money. They kind of tie their hands. That changes if you're being targeted by kind of different types of offenders. There's some who their goal is to spread your images kind of online, and as horrible as it is, it might be something that you have to document as well, and kind of add that to your package that you send to law enforcement. And if that does happen, especially if you're a minor, you can use different resources, such as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has a take it down system where you can where you can get them to use their crawlers like through the internet, and then it will flag and take down your images, or at least publish kind of a notice that encourages the platform to take it down. And that can help to reduce the spread and get those images offline if they do end up online.
The Cyber Civil Rights has something similar for adult victims as well, kind of a similar like hashing, take it down. But telling people report it, file the report with someone is so hard to give people as a response, because people want justice, right? And however they conceptualize that, the offender arrested, recouping what they've lost, etc. But we are truly right now at a point where we just need to know all that we can about it, and even just getting records of where it's happening and to whom is like the point that we're at to even start responding to it. Because without knowing what the problem is, how are you supposed to know where to start and that you're tackling the right thing? But it's a tough spot, I think, to respond to victims right now. Especially with law enforcement who feel that they're tasked with fulfilling that sense of justice that people are seeking. I think it's a hard one.
I think it goes up the chain too, right? Prosecutors don't necessarily have the tools they need to handle this, at least in certain jurisdictions. And judges may not also have the resolutions they want, right? They may be able to see this and say, yeah, I think something happened here, but we don't have the laws on the books to do anything about it. And so I think that response is so difficult in the moment, but also just as a system, we feel like we're letting people down, and that's not what we want, and that's not what's going to get people to believe in us as a system. And so just so difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Since it seems like industry has really taken over to some degree the policing of the internet, and you've mentioned already different services that can engage in some kind of takedown based on intellectual property violations, do you think educating the average person, like whether it's through, I know sex education in schools is kind of its own thing, but if there were a way to push a little bit of public education around your image is your property and you should treat it as such, do you think that would make a difference, or is that just kind of tilting at windmills?
I think it could. I think it totally could. I think that people should take, ownership of their images. I think that they should feel like there are strategies that they can go through if their images is distributed and they don't want it to be. Like, it's your image. Like, you do something about your image. Like, you are the steward of your reputation, and like this is something that you can do. And I think that part of that conversation comes with the idea that there is a perpetrator, and that you having the image shouldn't be something that you're shamed for. Like, this is your image, but the crime is that someone shared it outside of how you wanted it to be shared. And I think that there's a lot of like self-blame that people who do have these images feel so much guilt over either like having the sext or having like the image even exist, that they feel like they can't do anything because they're part of like it's partially their fault, I think, is how like victims often think about it. And I think that part of the messaging of like, this is your image, like you can get it taken down, like there are strategies for you to kind of use some of these alternative avenues for getting it off the internet, also comes with the understanding that like this isn't your fault, and that this is something that someone did to you, and that like there is a person who can be held responsible for this kind of behavior, and that we shouldn't be sharing images of people without their consent.
Mm-hmm. That's something that gets me riled up, is just kind of the relationship between this puritanical take on taking sexual pictures of yourself, having sexual relations, to the point where people feel like they've done something so shameful that they deserve a crime being perpetrated against them. And I think separating those two things, as far as, healthy sexual interactions and sexual imagery, from this idea of how it can be used against you, is so important. And I don't know that will ever happen on a wide scale.
It's interesting because what keeps popping into my head is, and I think I've brought this up before, but like Fortnite loading pages have cyber tips on them, right? I think this is a brilliant model. Why can't YouTube ads start having, you have to sit there and watch 15 seconds of it anyway. Why can't we start promoting this kind of, listen, you're going to be on this platform, you have to treat the content that you're putting on it as everyone is going to have access to it, right? Like, start putting it into that messaging, and I think it would help. But it's on the platforms to do it.
Right. Yeah. That's everything I advocate for is messaging where the victims are, where the potential victims are, is like getting the word out to them. Like I think information is key when it comes to keeping yourself safe and knowing how to keep yourself safe and kind of what the issues are. And if you can spread that awareness in the places where people are ready to see it, and they see it all the time, then maybe it'll start to actually click, and they can really kind of inform behavior change. And on the space of education and kind of different policies, like I think that the best policies are the policies that meet people where they are. Like, I think that there's a real danger in promoting educational policies that say, don't do this, or we shouldn't use technology this way, or that you shouldn't ever create kind of a sexual image and send it to a romantic partner, because the reality is that people do, and that it's actually a very common behavior. And if it's really common, then saying don't do that is not actually really helpful. Like, we have to have education that meets people where they are, how the technology is being used, whether we agree with it, whether we think it's right or not. I think if you want to impact the most people, you have to just meet people and have policies where the problem is, and that really just like has a mindfulness about like where people are at the time, like, and just really respects the fact that this is the reality of how people are using technology. So what do we do given this reality?
Amen. Yeah. Like, you can't design policy to how you ideally want human beings to act. You can't. It doesn't work.
You just can't. It doesn't work. And like, especially when you're talking about teenagers, like teenagers, their frontal lobe is not even fully developed, and like they're going to use they're going to make mistakes, they're going to do things wrong, and you can't expect them to be like adults. And 2020 hindsight is great, but it's not helpful in the moment when it comes to actually preventing or responding to crime.
I think too, like, as a parent, having to have those tough conversations are already hard enough, but in this instance, it's about reducing harm, right? It's about making sure that my kid is not put at risk in any capacity. And so having to have those conversations about sex and identity and all that is already so difficult. But if you're not having those conversations, your kids aren't learning about this, that it is normal and it is okay to do these things, right, in a safe and responsible fashion. And so I can't imagine having to have that conversation of, yes, you can do these things, that's normal, but you have to make sure someone that bad doesn't get their hands on it, right? It's
and I think that that one of a huge lifts, I think, for parents and parent education is to switch your mindset, like especially when dealing with teenagers. This is a time period where teens are really looking to their peers. They're not communicating as well with their parents, but you just have to keep trying, because maybe saying, I really don't think that you should send sexually explicit images to other people because there's a risk and XYZ. It might not necessarily change their behavior, but what it does do is know that you are a safe person to come to if anything goes wrong. And I think that is like the big kind of key for like parents is like, you know, teenagers are hard, young people are hard, they're very secretive, they're looking to their friends, they're looking to their peers and copying what their peers are doing and all of that pressure. But by having these conversations over and over again, you're letting them know that you get it and that you understand, and that if something goes wrong, they can talk to you, and if they, before they do something, they can talk to you. And I think that that is critical.
So we've talked a lot about sextortion as a whole. One question, because maybe people are wondering this, what's the likely proportion of people who experience this? So are we talking like 50% of the population? Is it more like 10%? What are some good estimates of how many people actually experience sextortion?
Oh, wow. So we have kind of some old data, I think, on this problem. And the ranges, depending on kind of how you define it, really impact the prevalence rates. I think that's always the reality of social science. I think the last estimate I saw when it comes to sextortion, within the context of like intimate partner violences, it's about 7 to 10% of the population have been victimized by something like this. When it comes to young children being targeted and solicited by strangers online, that percentage gets a little bit lower. It's more like 1 to 5%. However, we don't really know a lot about financial sextortion. It seems to be the fastest growing form of sextortion, and there really isn't a lot of really great data. And also, when you think about some of the larger surveys that have been done with adolescents who've just been experiencing kind of image-based abuse type crimes, like I've seen ranges from 3% all the way to like 36%. So like really kind of high. So I think really there is a lack of current data, especially current U.S. data. A lot of the people leading the charge kind of in this front seems to be Australia and Canada and New Zealand and the UK have been much more on top of collecting this data than I think the United States has been. So it's kind of hard to know. All I'll say is that the financial sextortion crimes are increasing astronomically. I wouldn't be surprised at a higher prevalence rate for those kinds of crimes right now.
We just recently did a survey of Michigan residents, and we found about a 3% victimization rate out of about 1,300 people. So I guess we're somewhere in the margins, but... Yeah, definitely in the margins. I think that's kind of where we've been seeing kind of a narrowing.
I just keep thinking, like, 1% is a tiny, percentage, but 1% of every child, like, that's a huge number. And it's, to think that it's just growing exponentially just emphasizes the need for that education.
And very few, if none of those people indicated they reported to police, correct?
I think it was about half. So out of maybe 20 people, out of about 40 people, 20 reported.
Okay, that's more than I had thought, but still, yeah.
That's pretty good. Yeah, but reporting seems to be fairly low, and some of my research on reporting that I'm conducting now, it seems that the biggest predictor of like a higher likelihood of reporting to law enforcement is really if they paid their sextortionist. Seems to be like a big push to contacting law enforcement, but a lot of people just want to forget about it and move on and choose not to call the police.
What do you see as the next big thing that we need to worry about with respect to sextortion? Like, what's your biggest horizon level fear?
I think the next big thing and the fear really does kind of revolve around AI and the use of AI and artificial intelligence for a lot of reasons. One, I think the AI images is going to be a really big problem, but I also think that AI is facilitating the scams to be more effective. Like, I think that some people with kind of just a rudimentary understanding of cybercrime, know to be suspicious of profiles and applications where maybe like English language is not as strong, or that seems to not, like, just different elements don't stack up. And now I think with AI, you can make those things look a lot more real. You can sound like you're from a different place than you are. You can make more effective fake profile pictures. So you can make an account full of fake profile pictures that are of this person, and then it becomes more effective and looks like a more legit account. So I think those things are definitely really, really concerning. I'm definitely afraid of all the AI.
It kind of sucks to end on being afraid, but I think that's unfortunately the nature of this. You know, it is scary and it is concerning, particularly, you know, for those of us that are responsible for little adults. You know, it's how do I have these conversations with them without being the weird, awkward dad? No offense.
I think, to be fair, those are your own words at some point.
But
It is super hard to do. I don't know how to do it, and we have an 11-year-old who doesn't even want to hear about this kind of stuff. And I get it. I understand. And we're in a house where both of us are criminologists, and so constantly we're talking about things that they absolutely don't want to hear. And so I would get it where we're the weird parents because. But if we were in any other area or any other line of work, if we were talking about this, it might be kind of like, oh, I should listen because they never talk about this. Maybe. But because we're constantly talking about this, and my wife being a sex researcher has stuff sitting around the house too, so books on sexual violence and things like that. So for them, it's probably like, oh, this is a topic we know so much about. But that's a very unique situation relative to others.
Maybe you're training the trainers, and your kids are going to go teach the other kids how to not fall victim. Maybe that's what it is. Honestly, I've thought about this, right? Maybe we need like a Big Brother kind of system where you can bring in some like peers and they can teach, because
Cyber stewards.
yeah, there we go.
It would certainly go over better.
I know. I was also going to add, I've just like started thinking more about kind of that question of the things that like I'm more concerned about when it comes to sextortion crimes, is these abuse by proxy kind of cases that I'm talking about, where we've been seeing a lot of instances in which, especially children who are being targeted by sextortion, part of the demand is to abuse other children around them, which then opens up just kind of the impact that one person a million miles away can have on a victim, on their family, on other peers that are around that core victim. And it's becoming a lot more of an issue than I think I previously thought. I think getting kind of involved in some of these more recent sextortion cases against children, it seems that there are predators and organizations that are generally operating kind of like on the dark web, where a huge portion of them generating more child sexual abuse material comes from these sextortion type crimes. There was like a recent investigation into kind of what child pornography has kind of looked like across just several kind of years, like the last 10 years. And this year was the first year that these self-generated types of pornography, like things that are made with smart cams and webcams, have now like exceeded the amount of other kinds of child pornography production online. So I think sextortion crimes are fueling kind of what the overall CSAM looks like through the dark web. And I know, like, personally, like, from different kinds of cases, that there are people who are specifically aiming to target minors for the purpose of them abusing other minors to create more extreme types of CSAM that then get distributed across the dark web. And that has a huge implication because it turns victims into offenders. It turns one victim into 4 victims for 3 victims, and it can be really, really troubling. And we've seen kind of like the main age like of the CSAM that exists on the dark web is 7 to 13. It's really young, and so it's really devastating. And I think sextortion is really part of kind of that, and that is like the worst way to end this kind of segment, but it is really concerning.
Yeah.
So
I'll say, tying it back into our story at the top, you think that child that took his own life probably thought he was going to get in trouble because he had engaged in this kind of by proxy behavior, and it just highlights the need for a good response by law enforcement. Maybe it's not armed officers going to meet the child. Maybe, let's think about who we're sending to the door, how they're having these discussions. I know we've talked about victim advocacy centers and the role that they can play, and so I certainly think that is going to be a concern when we highlight the fact that our response is not prepared for, I would say, more basic cases, let alone the ones where they're engaging with their peers as well.
And not to harp on this point too much too, but one of the things that is really interesting to me is the commonalities across offenses too. So, you look at the Dutch researchers looking at phishing and other types of crime that are networked to a degree. And so sextortion is now an offense that is to a certain extent networked, where you have a victim who is then victimizing others. So it creates these physical, localized networks as a function of someone coming in remotely. And that's disturbing that we can see this kind of general persistence in certain characteristics of cybercrime. Now this offline online nexus, crime is crime.
There it is.
The extortion part, right, is something that is as old as time. If someone has something over you, they have power over you, they can coerce you into doing something. That piece of it is not new at all. It's the way it's being facilitated. And I think that's our through line we keep returning to anyways, but I think it's so crucial.
yeah, and the organization is really complicated. So there's a huge overlap between these financial sextortion crimes and human trafficking. There are literal human trafficking victims who are recruited to perpetrate these types of crimes, and then it's just this really complicated picture of exploitation for everyone. And so it really overlaps with so many different kinds of crime problems. Like, it's really much of a more complicated issue that to tackle when you bring in kind of all of the different players kind of in these networks.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up, a question that we ask all of our guests is, to the best of your ability, how would you sum up this problem in terms of what you would want the average person to know about it?
I guess I'd want the average person to know that these crimes are increasing. They're becoming a lot more prevalent, and that if you are victimized, it's not your fault. These individuals are really very, very clever. They do everything they can to trick you and to scam you, and they're very effective at the one job that they've decided to invest their resources in. But that you're definitely not alone, that there are certain red flags that you can look out for about kind of these different scams, really kind of looking at the behavior and comparing kind of what is said versus what they want you to believe. So for example, avoiding friending strangers that you don't know is always probably the primary way to keep yourself safe. Looking for these kind of young type of accounts, individuals who keep making excuses for why they can't communicate with you in person or through their webcam, or that their webcam's broken, or all of these kinds of excuses that they use. People who try to get you to friend them across multiple different kinds of platforms is definitely a red flag, especially if they're a stranger. And also people who just start to express very strong emotions, like very, very quickly, is usually probably the biggest red flag that you should start to be like a little bit more skeptical of. I want people to be as aware of kind of like the red flags related to extortion and sexual solicitation the way they are for like a bad phishing text. Like, I want people to start to think about it and say, this isn't real, this is bad, like I need to avoid this. Because the reality of the situation is that a lot of these people are sending out like 100 little like intro messages a day, just hoping someone is going to click on it. And if you're more aware kind of what these things look like, and you are more skeptical of strangers online, I think you'll be just fine.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I feel like we could talk about this for hours and hours. So we will definitely have to have you back on, because I know this is an issue that's going to unfortunately keep evolving, and there's going to be new wrinkles that I'm sure you'll be on top of. So we look forward to having you back on to talk about these issues moving forward.
Awesome.
Yeah, so thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And if you enjoyed the show, please make sure you like and subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite podcast catcher. And we will catch you the next time we cross the firewall. Thanks for listening to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. This is a production of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, produced by J.J. Thomas. The thoughts and opinions expressed are those of the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the university. If you have a comment or a question about the show, please email us at crossingthefirewall@gmail.com. Also, make sure that you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for more information. And if you're enjoying us on your favorite podcast app, please make sure that you like the show and leave us a review so that way everybody knows what we're up to. And if you're listening in on YouTube, make sure that you like us and subscribe so that way you're staying up to date on everything that is crossing the firewall.